The Lioness hit the ground with 300 pounds of fury, pinning the hyena's skull into red Okavango mud. Its jaw snapped sideways, bone cracked, the hyena screamed, and the 6 others behind it scattered into the tall grass, but not far enough, not nearly far enough. What happened in the next 72 hours would become Okavango Delta legend, a story whispered about by rangers and bush pilots and safari guides for decades, because this wasn't a simple predator versus scavenger fight. This was a mother who had just lost everything. And the force that stepped in to stand beside her? Nobody saw that coming. Nobody. Let me set the stage fast. Northern Botswana. Dry season. A lioness named Kylo by the researchers who tracked her. No pride, no male, no backup. She'd been alone for 11 months after a territorial war split her family apart. But she wasn't just surviving. She was raising a single cub. A male, maybe 4 months old, small for his age, wobbly on his legs, completely dependent on a mother who hadn't eaten in 6 days. Kylo was hunting warthog near a shallow channel when the hyena clan found her den. Believe me, what hyenas do to unguarded cubs isn't something you narrate for entertainment. 7 of them moved in. The cub didn't stand a chance. By the time Kylo heard the noise and broke into a dead sprint across 400 meters of open floodplain, the den was empty. Tufts of fur on the sand, blood trails leading into thick brush. Her cub was gone. She circled that den for 9 hours. 9 hours. Not sitting, not sleeping. Walking the perimeter in a tight loop, calling out with low-contact grunts that researchers later described as distress vocalizations they'd never recorded at that frequency before. The sound was constant, every 20 seconds. A deep, guttural pulse that carried across the water for a mile in every direction. Now, here's where the story turns. 3 kilometers east, camped along a narrow channel in a cluster of modified land cruisers and open-air tents, sat a very unusual group of men. 8 of them, all American. The camp staff knew them as a private safari group, wealthy, quiet, polite, tipped well. But the head guide, a Botswana man named Tao, had done 20 years of this work. He recognized the way these men moved, the economy of motion, the way they swept every new environment with their eyes before sitting down, the way none of them ever had their back to an open space. Get this. Tao pulled aside the booking coordinator and asked a single question. Are these men military? The coordinator said she couldn't say. Tao nodded. That told him enough. These 8 men were current and former operators from the United States Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the unit most people call Delta Force. They were on a decompression trip. 4 of them had just rotated out of a deployment they would never talk about, in a country they would never name. The trip was organized by one of their own, a master sergeant named Colt Rains, who'd done 3 previous safaris in Botswana and loved the Delta, the water one, not the unit, more than any place on Earth. Rains heard the Lioness at 0200 hours. He sat up on his cot, boots already next to his hand, and listened. The grunting was faint but rhythmic, and it didn't stop. He pulled on his boots, stepped outside the tent, and found Tao already standing by the fire pit, arms crossed, staring east into the darkness. "What is that?" Rains said. Tao didn't turn around. A mother looking for something she won't find. Rains stood next to him. Neither man spoke for a full minute. The grunting continued. Rains's jaw tightened. He went back into the tent and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I swear this happened. At first light, before coffee, before anyone else in camp stirred. Rains was at the land cruiser, asking Tao to take him toward the sound. Tao hesitated. This wasn't part of the itinerary. But something in Rain's voice, not a command, more of a quiet request from a man who understood loss, made Tao grab the keys. They drove 20 minutes through shallow water and mopane scrub. The grunting got louder. Tao stopped the vehicle on a low ridge overlooking a sandy clearing ringed with tall grass. Kylo was still circling. A pause had worn a visible track into the sand, a perfect oval, maybe 30 meters around. She was thinner than she should have been. Her ribs showed through her coat. Her eyes were open but unfocused, moving across the ground with each pass as if the cub might reappear in the dirt. Rains didn't say anything for a long time, He just watched. Then he said 5 words that Tao later repeated to every researcher and journalist who asked about what happened next. "We need to help her." Tao turned in the driver's seat. "She is wild, Colt. We don't interfere. That is the rule." Rains nodded. "I heard you. What's killing her?" "Hyenas took the cub. Probably last night. The clan that dens near the eastern lagoon. 7, maybe 8 animals. They've been aggressive this season. The drought pushed them into lion territory." Rains looked at the track Kalo had worn in the sand. He looked at the blood near the den entrance. He looked at Tao. What happens to her now? Tao's answer was clinical. A lone lioness without a pride, without a cub, malnourished and exhausted from calling all night, would either find food in the next 48 hours or begin to decline. Without the motivation of a cub to feed, a grief-stricken lioness sometimes simply stopped hunting. It wasn't anthropomorphism, it was documented. The hormonal crash after cub loss could suppress predatory behavior for days, sometimes weeks. In that window, dehydration or opportunistic attack from the same hyena clan could finish the job. Rains stepped down from the vehicle. Tao grabbed his arm. "You cannot approach her." "I'm not going to approach her." Rains walked 10 meters to the left and crouched on the ridge, studying the terrain. Tao watched him scan the landscape the way a man reads a battlefield. Cover, lines of sight, avenues of approach and retreat, water sources, high ground. Here's what nobody tells you about Delta operators. Their training doesn't switch off. Problem-solving in hostile terrain is what their brains do automatically, whether the problem is a hostage rescue in Mogadishu or a starving lioness in Botswana. Rains wasn't being theatrical. He was doing the only thing he knew how to do, assess a situation and build a plan. He got back in the vehicle. "Take me to camp. I need to talk to the guys." By 0730, all 8 men were gathered around a folding table under a canvas awning, coffee untouched, listening to Rains describe what he'd seen. Tao stood nearby, arms folded, deeply skeptical but unable to walk away from whatever was building. Rains laid it out fast. The lioness was in a death spiral. The hyenas would come back. They always did, and she was too weak and too distracted to fight them off again. The researchers who monitored her wouldn't intervene because of non-interference protocols. The camp couldn't do anything because of tourism regulations. But 8 men with nothing on their schedule for the next 3 days and a lifetime of experience in hostile environment problem-solving, they could do something. Maybe. A guy named Briggs, stocky, shaved head, quiet in the way men are quiet when they've seen too much, leaned forward. "What exactly are we talking about here?" Rains pulled out a hand-drawn map on the back of a camp brochure. 3 things. First, she needs to eat. She hasn't had a kill in almost a week. If she doesn't eat in the next 24 hours, she's done. Second, the hyena clan needs to be pushed out of her territory. Not killed, pushed, far enough that she gets space to recover. Third, she needs to snap out of the circling behavior. Something has to break the loop. No kidding. Briggs looked at the map, looked at Rains and said, "You're asking us to run a security operation for a lion. I'm asking us to keep something alive that deserves to be alive." The room went quiet. Then a third man, tall, early 40s, wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a professor than a Tier 1 operator. Everyone called him Doc because he was the team's medic, stood up and walked to the map. He tapped the eastern lagoon where the hyena clan denned. Hyenas are habitual. They patrol the same corridors at dusk and dawn. If we disrupt their pattern for 2 or 3 cycles, they'll relocate their patrol. We don't need to confront them. We need to make their current route uncomfortable. Tao stepped forward. "This is not permitted. You are tourists." Rains looked at him. "Tao, what's the survival rate for a lone lioness with no pride and no cub in this part of the Delta during dry season?" Tao said nothing. "How many have you watched die?" Tao's shoulders dropped an inch. He closed his eyes briefly. 4. I have watched 4. How many did you want to help? All of them. Rains put his hand on Tao's shoulder. Then help us help this one. And that, right there, was the moment this story split from a sad wildlife documentary into something else entirely. Because Tao didn't just agree. He became the tactical brain of the entire operation. He knew the land, he knew the animals, he knew what was legal, what was grey area, and what would get everyone thrown out of the country. And he navigated all three with the precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades reading the Okavango the way these soldiers read a combat zone. Here's what they did. Phase 1, feed the lioness. They couldn't hunt for her. They couldn't drop carcasses near her den. Both were illegal. But Tao knew something. A Cape buffalo had been killed by a crocodile 2 days earlier at a crossing point 1 kilometer south of Kylo's position. The carcass was mostly submerged, caught on a sandbar, and the current was slowly pushing it downstream. If someone were to reposition a fallen tree, say, drag a dead mopane trunk into the channel at a specific angle, the current would pin the carcass against the bank at a point directly downwind from the lioness's circling route. Rains looked at Doc. Doc looked at Briggs. Nobody said a word. 3 of them got in the water. You need to understand something about the Okavango Delta. The channels are full of crocodiles, not small ones, Nile crocodiles. Animals that can hit 16 feet and weigh 1,000 pounds. Getting into a delta channel to reposition a log isn't a task, it's a gamble with your life. Briggs went in first, testing depth, feeling the bottom with his boots. The water hit his chest. Rains and Doc flanked him 20 meters apart, watching the surface for the telltale ripple of a submerged croc approaching. 2 other operators, a sniper named Wheeler and a demo specialist called Pike, stood on the bank with the camp spotlight, scanning the channel. Trust me on this. These men had been in firefights in 6 countries, and 3 of them later said the 20 minutes they spent in that crocodile-infested channel were among the most terrifying of their lives. You can shoot back at a human adversary. You can't negotiate with a 16-foot reptile in murky water. They dragged the mopane trunk into position. The current did the rest. Within 4 hours, the buffalo carcass lodged against the bank exactly where Tao predicted, 1 kilometer south of the lioness, directly in the path of the prevailing wind. Kilo stopped circling at midday. Her head came up. Nostrils flared. She stood motionless for a full minute, processing the scent. Then she moved. Not fast. Not with the explosive acceleration of a hunting lioness. She walked, deliberately, south, toward food. Rains watched through binoculars from 400 meters and let out a breath he'd been holding since dawn. Phase 1 complete, he said. And even Tao, who had resisted every step of this plan, allowed himself a small nod. But here's the thing, feeding her once didn't fix anything. The hyena clan was still out there, and they were about to come back. Phase 2 started at sundown. Tao drove the team to the eastern lagoon in 2 vehicles, no headlights, navigating by moonlight and GPS. They parked a kilometer from the hyena den site and moved on foot. Now listen, they didn't touch the hyenas. They didn't trap them, shoot them, or physically confront them. What they did was far more creative, and according to Tao, probably not illegal. Probably. Doc had spent the afternoon collecting elephant dung. Massive quantities of it. Fresh. The Delta doesn't lack for elephant dung. He mixed it with water and urine collected from the camp's compost toilet, human urine, and created what Rains described with a straight face as the single worst substance I have ever been near in 30 years of service, and I have been near some terrible substances. They painted it on trees, rocks, and termite mounds along the hyena clan's 3 primary patrol corridors leading toward Kylo's territory. Every surface a hyena would sniff, mark, or rub against on their nightly route. Here's what nobody tells you about hyena behavior. They're brilliant. They have spatial memory that rivals primates. And they are deeply suspicious of unfamiliar scent combinations in their territory. A corridor that suddenly reeks of elephant and human? That's not a corridor a hyena clan uses twice. It screams danger. It screams ambush. It screams find another route. By midnight, Tao confirmed through his tracking knowledge and the distant sound of whooping calls that the clan had diverted northeast, away from the lioness, toward an alternate hunting ground near a Makoro station 3 kilometers off. Phase 2 done. But the operation wasn't finished. because at 0300, Kalo did something no one expected. She went back to the den. She'd eaten. She was stronger. The hyenas were gone, and she walked straight back to that oval track in the sand and started circling again. The grunting resumed, that low, rhythmic, desperate call for a cub that wasn't coming home. Rains was in his tent. He heard it start. He sat on the edge of his cot, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since they arrived, the other men saw something in his face they didn't recognize. Not determination, not tactical focus. Something heavier. Doc sat down next to him. Didn't say anything at first. Cold. I hear her. You can't fix that part. Rains rubbed his face with both hands. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. My daughter was 4 when I missed her surgery. I was in a country I can't name, doing a job I can't talk about, and my little girl went into an operating room and I wasn't there. Jen held her hand. I was 8,000 miles away, listening to a radio. Doc put his hand on Rain's back. She's fine now. She's 12, she plays soccer, she's fine. But that sound. He pointed toward the darkness. That sound. I know what that is. This part right here, this is where the story gets its spine. Because Rain stood up, he wiped his face, and he said, we need to break the loop. At dawn, Tao presented an idea he'd been holding back because he thought it was insane. 40 kilometers south, at a wildlife rehabilitation station near Marne, a lioness had been brought in 2 weeks earlier, after being hit by a truck near the highway. She'd survived, but her injuries were severe enough that she'd been tranquilized for transport. That lioness had 2 cubs, approximately 3 months old, who'd been held at the station while their mother recovered. The mother had died 3 days ago from internal injuries. The cubs were orphans. The station was preparing to hand-raise them, which usually meant a life in captivity. Tao knew the station manager, a woman named Lorato who had been fighting for 20 years to rehabilitate predators into the wild against every bureaucratic obstacle imaginable. Rains looked at Tao. You're suggesting what I think you're suggesting. I'm suggesting we make a phone call. Will it work? Tao's answer was honest. It has worked 3 times in recorded history. It has failed more times than that. A bereaved lioness will sometimes adopt an orphaned cub if the timing is right, if the cub is the right age, if her hormonal state is receptive, or she will kill it. There is no way to know. Rains turned to the group. Every man was already standing. Who's driving? Pike grabbed the keys. The drive to Marne took 4 hours on dirt tracks that turned to sand that turned to pavement. Rains and Tao sat in the front vehicle. They didn't talk much. When they pulled into the rehab station, Lorato was waiting at the gate. She was maybe 50, short grey hair, hands rough from decades of physical work with animals, and an expression that said she'd heard 100 crazy proposals and survived all of them. Tao introduced Rains. Rains said exactly 1 sentence to her. I have a mother with no cub and you have a cub with no mother. Help me put them together. Lorato studied him. You're not a researcher. No, ma'am. You're not a conservationist. No. Then, why are you here? Rains didn't hesitate. Because I heard her calling. Lorato brought them to the enclosure. 2 cubs, small, healthy, fed on bottle formula, tumbling over each other in a concrete pen, 1 male, 1 female. The female was slightly smaller, and according to Lorato, the more docile of the 2, less likely to provoke a defensive response in an unfamiliar adult. Now listen carefully because this is where the science gets real. Lorato explained the protocol. The cub would need to be rubbed with material from the lioness's den, sand, fur, scent markers, to mask the orphan smell. The introduction would need to happen when the lioness was in a calm state, not actively distressed. The cub would need to be placed close enough that the lioness would investigate, but far enough that retreat was possible if she reacted aggressively. And someone would need to be on standby with a tranquilizer rifle in case it went wrong. That someone would be me, Lorato said. She grabbed a bag, a dart rifle, and a cooler formula. She was in the vehicle in 4 minutes. For real. This woman didn't hesitate. She'd been waiting for this chance for months, and she later told a documentary crew that when she saw the look in Rains's eyes, she knew this wasn't a stunt, this was a rescue. They drove back. 4 hours. The cub rode in a ventilated crate on Lorato's lap. She kept one hand on the crate at all times, murmuring in Setswana, keeping the animal calm. Rains drove the last hour himself because Pike was nodding off, and he took every pothole at exactly the right speed to minimize jolts to the crate. They arrived at the Delta camp at dusk. Kyla was still circling, still calling. Lorato got out, listened for 30 seconds, and said to Tao, "Her cortisol is dropping. You can hear it in the intervals. She's moving from active search to passive grief. This is the window." Tao and 2 of the operators had already collected material from the den. Sand saturated with Kylo's scent, tufts of fur from the den entrance, even fragments of the earth she'd been walking on for 36 hours. Lorato rubbed the cub thoroughly, every inch of fur, every paw pad. She worked fast, hands steady, decades of practice in every motion. Then she turned to Rains. "I need you to do something for me." "Name it." "I need you and every one of your men to disappear. No vehicles within a kilometer. No human presence, no human scent. This is between her and the cub now. I'll stay at 200 meters with the dart gun. Tao stays with me. Everyone else, gone." Rains nodded. He looked at his team. Every man moved to the vehicles without a word. Boots on pedals, engines fired, gone in 90 seconds. Military precision applied to the gentlest possible purpose. Lorato and Tao moved to a position on the ridge, downwind. Lorato placed the cub in a shallow depression in the sand, 15 meters from the edge of Kylo's circling track, sheltered by a low shrub. The cub mewed, once, soft, confused, hungry. Then Lorato backed away. This is the part of the story where I wish I could have been there, because what happened next was witnessed by only 2 people, Lorato and Tao, and their accounts matched so precisely that researchers later said the observations had scientific value. Kylo completed her circle. She passed the depression. She didn't stop. Second circle. She passed again. Lorato's finger rested on the trigger guard of the dart rifle. Tao held binoculars so hard his knuckles went pale. Third circle. Kylo slowed. Her head turned. Her nostrils worked. She stopped walking. The cub mewed again. Kylo turned her entire body toward the sound. She lowered her head. She took 1 step, then another. Then she froze, front paw lifted, ears flat, tail rigid. Every muscle in her body was coiled between 2 possible outcomes. You have to understand, this was not a gentle moment. This was a 300-pound apex predator, hormonally wrecked, sleep-deprived, grieving, and now confronted with an unfamiliar living thing in her territory that smelled almost, but not exactly, like her own cub. The calculus happening in her brain was millions of years old. Accept or destroy. Mother or predator. There was no middle ground. Lorato's finger touched the trigger. Kylo dropped her head lower. She extended her nose toward the cub. The cub, operating on nothing but instinct, rolled onto its back and exposed its belly. Total submission, total vulnerability. One tiny animal, maybe 5 pounds, offering itself completely to the judgment of a creature 60 times its size. Kylo sniffed the cub's belly. She sniffed its head. She sniffed the sand around it. Her tail relaxed 1 degree, then another. Then she did something that made Tao grab Lorato's arm. She lay down, not next to the cub, around it. She curled her body into a C shape, enclosing the cub against her belly, and she began to groom it. Long, slow strokes of her tongue across the cub's head and neck. The cub squirmed, found a nipple, and latched on. Lorato took her finger off the trigger. She set the rifle down on the ground. She sat in the dirt and put her hands over her face. Tao radioed the camp, 2 words. She took it. Rains was leaning against the land cruiser a kilometer away when the radio crackled. He picked it up, listened, set it down, walked 10 steps into the bush, put his hands on his knees and stayed like that for a while. When he came back, Briggs handed him a tin cup of coffee. Nobody asked him anything. Nobody needed to. Now listen, if you've watched this far, you already understand that this story isn't really about lions. Hit subscribe right now, because what I tell you next is the part that turns this from a wildlife rescue into something permanent. Over the next 48 hours, Rains and his team maintained the scent barriers on the hyena corridors. They did 3 more applications, each time at night, each time on foot, each time navigating croc-infested terrain and pitch darkness. Wheeler, the sniper, set up an observation post on the ridge and ran 6-hour shifts with Pike, monitoring Kalo and the cub through a spotting scope. Doc kept a medical log. The cub's nursing frequency, Kalo's movement patterns, the distances between rest periods. They ran it with the same discipline they'd apply to a forward operating base. And Tao, who had started this story as a skeptic, was at the center of every decision. On the second morning, Kalo did something that confirmed the adoption was holding. She moved a cub, picked it up by the scruff, walked 200 meters to a new den site, higher ground, better cover, closer to water. A mother choosing a home for her child, not grieving, not circling, hunting ground, shelter, escape routes. She was planning a future. Rains watched through the scope. He didn't say a word. He handed the binoculars to Briggs. Briggs watched for 30 seconds, then handed them to Doc. They passed them down the line, 8 men standing on a ridge in Botswana, watching a lioness carry a cub that wasn't biologically hers to a den she'd chosen with the same tactical precision they would have used themselves. The hyena clan never came back. Tao confirmed a week later that they'd established new patrol routes 3 kilometers northeast, away from Kylo's territory. The scent barriers degraded naturally, but by then the hyenas had imprinted on the new corridors. Lorato returned to the rehab station and placed the second cub, the male, with a wildlife sanctuary near Kasane, where he was eventually introduced to a small pride as a juvenile. He survived. Both cubs survived. Kylo nursed the adopted female for 5 months. Researchers from the Botswana Predator Conservation Trust documented the entire relationship. The cub, named Thari by Lorato, the Setswana word for blessing, grew at a normal rate, hit every developmental milestone, and by 8 months was participating in hunts alongside her adopted mother. But here's the part that nobody expected. 15 months after the adoption, Kylo encountered a nomadic male near the western floodplain. She mated. She became pregnant. And when she gave birth to 2 new cubs of her own, she did not reject Thari. The adopted female remained part of the family. Researchers documented Thari grooming the newborns, standing watch while Kylo hunted, and eventually helping to raise the new cubs as a subadult female, exactly the role she would have played in a biological pride. Kylo had built a pride from nothing, a lone lioness, stripped of her family, stripped of her cub, starving, circling a patch of sand in the dark, calling for something that would never answer, and she built it back. One adopted cub, one chance, one night where the calculus tipped toward acceptance instead of destruction. Rains and his team left Botswana 4 days after the adoption. There was no ceremony, no group photo. Tao drove them to the airstrip at Marne. They shook hands. Rains gave Tao a folded piece of paper with a satellite phone number written on it. "You ever need anything?" he said. Tao took the paper. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "You are a strange group of tourists." Rains almost laughed. Almost. Copy that. 3 years later, Tao used the number. Not for himself. An anti-poaching unit near Chobe was underfunded and about to lose its aerial surveillance capability, a single-engine Cessna with a cracked engine block. Rains made 2 phone calls. Within 6 weeks, a refurbished aircraft arrived at Kasane Airport, funded by a foundation that didn't have a website and didn't seek publicity. The foundation's paperwork listed 8 donors, all American, all anonymous. Tao never asked for details. He didn't need them. 2 years after that, Lorato received a grant from the same foundation to expand her rehabilitation facility. New enclosures, a veterinary theater, and a full-time staff position for a large predator behavioral specialist. The grant letter was 1 page. No jargon, no corporate branding. The final line read, "For the ones who circle in the dark." Rains wrote that line. I confirmed it. And Kalo. As of the last documented sighting, she was alive, healthy, running a pride of 5, herself, Thari, and 3 younger cubs. Her territory covered 12 square kilometers of prime delta real estate, water-rich, prey-dense, defensible. She had become, against every statistical probability, exactly what the researchers said a lone lioness could never become, a matriarch. Thari, the adopted cub, the 5-pound orphan who rolled onto her back in the sand and offered her belly to a grieving stranger, grew into a 280-pound huntress who held the eastern boundary of her mother's territory with a ferocity that surprised even the researchers who'd watched her grow up. She was not gentle. She was not sentimental. She was a predator, shaped by the Okavango, raised by a mother who chose her when biology said don't. And in a camp along a narrow channel, Tao still tells this story. Not to every group, not to every tourist, only to the ones who sit by the fire long enough and ask the right questions. He tells it the way I'm telling it to you now. Straight, no decorations, no exaggeration needed, because the truth of it is enough. A mother lost her child in the dark. 8 warriors from a world away heard her calling, and they did the only thing that warriors who've seen too much darkness know how to do. They walked toward the sound. And on a ridge in Botswana, standing next to a man named Tao, who'd watched 4 lionesses die because the rules said don't interfere, a soldier named Colt Rains delivered the only line that mattered. Quiet, under his breath. Not meant for anyone but himself, and the night air, and the sound of a cub nursing for the first time. That's enough.